Okay, so after a 6-week break, we are back in Genesis. I was laughing when because we're not quite halfway through Genesis, and this is session 26. So we are probably about halfway through the number of sessions it'll take to get through the book. It goes a little quicker on the back end. A lot of the hard questions and stuff that we look at come in the front half, more in the front half of the book. So we have to slow down a little more through those. So we're going to look at chapter 23 tonight. So we've just finished with God testing Abraham. That's what we finished with right before we went into the Easter experience. And so then it gave us the brief genealogy of Rebecca's family to introduce her, which she's going to show up later. And then tonight we move into Sarah's burial and what comes with that. And it is interesting. First line on my notes for tonight is that dealing with death is a natural part of life. Just think about that. Mike and have to deal with that right now. But dealing with death is a natural part of life. As we think about our main theme, God is faithful to His promises, even when fulfillment seems partial or hidden. God's faithful to His promises, even when fulfillment seems partial or hidden. So even when we don't know what God is doing or we're not sure how God is working, we can trust and have faith that God is still faithful. Genesis 23 teaches us that God's covenant faithfulness continues quietly and steadily, even through death, grief, and ordinary human transactions. What appears small, a burial plot, is actually a tangible sign that God's promises are advancing. So I'm going to say that again. Genesis 23 teaches that God's covenant faithfulness continues quietly and steadily, even through death and grief and ordinary human transactions. What appears small, a burial plot, is actually a tangible sign that God's promises are advancing. So as we look at this chapter, the first couple of verses, we see God's covenant history includes death as well as life. God's covenant history includes death as well as life. Sarah lived 127 years. These are all the years of her life. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abram went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Why do you think Scripture records Sarah's age and death so precisely?
Probably in relationship to Isaac, his birth, his birth for him.
Okay. So she would have been, how old would he have been at the time of her death?
Around 37.
Around 37, yeah.
She's the only woman whose age and death was recorded in the Bible.
Okay.
She was the mother of Israel.
Yep.
That's true. She's the mother of Israel. And the other, both,
Yeah.
12 tribes.
What does the inclusion of death teach us about how God works in history? What does the inclusion of death teach us about how God works in history?
It works the same all
All right, you look like that's a question more than an answer.
the time. No,
Okay.
it just seems so straightforward.
Okay.
You know? It never,
Everybody dies, right?
Well, I was gonna say, and if you look in the Bible, God uses death in different ways. Death of Jesus,
Yeah.
ultimate sacrifice for our sins. Death of David's son, punishment for his sin with Bathsheba.
Death of Moses.
Death of Moses, and more peaceful, but still final, so we couldn't go into the promised land. And so as you think about death, God uses it different ways at different times to help teach us different things.
Death of the firstborn of Egypt.
What's that?
The death of the firstborn of Egypt was.
Yep. And then hopefully that helps shape our understanding of God's faithfulness even across generations. One way to look at these first two verses is God's promises do not dissolve at death. The narrative continues, showing that covenant history moves forward even through human loss. So God's promises do not dissolve at death. The story narrative continues, showing that covenant history moves forward even through human loss. Okay, the next group of verses, we'll kind of look at them as God establishes his people as heirs even while they remain sojourners. God establishes his people as heirs even while they remain sojourners. So verse 3, when Abraham got up from beside his dead wife, he spoke to the Hethites, I am an alien residing among you. Give me burial property among you so that I can bury my dead. The Hethites replied to Abraham, listen to us, my Lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in our finest burial place. None of us will withhold from you his burial place for burying your dead. How do the people of the land describe Abraham, and what does that imply about God's work in his life? How do the people of the land describe Abraham, and what does that imply about God's work in his life?
My Bible, they call him God's chosen one.
God's chosen one, okay.
And therefore they're giving him the honors.
Okay.
It's a mighty prince in my Bible.
Okay, it's a mighty prince in your Bible, all right. What is that, so what does that kind of, what does that tell us, though, about how the people viewed Abraham and how God worked in his life?
Well, they had to view him with authority and might, and I think they attributed that a lot to his God.
Okay. All right. What tension do you notice between Abraham's status as a sojourner and God's promise of land? What tension do you notice between Abraham's status as a sojourner and God's promise of land?
Partial fulfillment, or
Well, we'll get there, because at this point there hadn't even been partial fulfillment. Because for all of Abraham's wanderings and being in the land, he doesn't technically own any of it. Which is a fascinating, I don't know about, as I was thinking about that, it was pretty much, we don't really have unclaimed land, right? I mean, since the land rush in the 1800s, we haven't had unclaimed land in our country or really around us. Somebody owns it. So it's interesting for Abraham, for all his wealth and all the different places that he lived, where Lot lived down at the bottom and all that, he's never owned anything. He's lived there, but he's always been a foreigner. He's always been a sojourner. He doesn't actually own any of the land that he's on. So you have to kind of just live in peace with the people around you because there's no official boundary, which for me is just a weird concept. Like, how do you know where you can go and can't go? I mean, it's just a fascinating concept to think that there's like not specific boundaries for stuff.
And they took up a lot of space too.
Yes, to have the wealth that he had, they'd have to take up a lot of space. And then part of the problem, the challenge that him and Lot had was they you're kind of confined in between people since you don't know it, and that's why they got so big for kind of the area they were trying to live in, and they had to split up. So it's
illegal immigrant.
yeah. So it is just kind of interesting that you got this picture. I mean, Abraham is a nomad. I mean, that's what he is. He is a nomad, sojourner, wanderer in this land. By the way, that's what Hebrews means. Is they were known as the wanderers. That's how the Hebrew and the language that I forget what Syrian or whatever language it is. They were called Abruhu in terms of the Hebrew, and that actually means the wanderers. But that's what they were, the wanderers in that area. And yet he's wandering, sojourning, in the land that God is giving to him. God, God, your descendants are going to own this. You're going to have all this land will be yours. It's not all this is yours now. It all will be yours. So there is a little bit of tension between those. But what does that reveal to us about the timing and manner of God's fulfillment? Or does it reveal anything to us about the time and manner of God's fulfillment?
Well, God knew that they were gonna provide give them a place, a fine place to bury Sarah.
Okay.
I have a question. What is the last line of your verse 6 say?
None of us will withhold from you his burial, his place for burying your dead.
Yeah. Who is his there? They're talking about God's place for you to bury?
Let's see,
Yes.
Abraham, Hittites. So the Hittites replied to Abraham, listen to us, they're speaking to Abraham,
Right.
among us bury your dead in our finest burial place, none of us will withhold from you his, yeah, it's basically anybody within your family. So his, being his or her
Okay.
burial place, all encompassing of his family.
Well, within,
Oh, no, sorry, Marcia, it's gonna be the person that owns the land.
Right.
So whoever owns the land, so if it's Bob's spot, Bob's not gonna withhold his land for you to bury it.
All right.
Odie?
I was saying, that's supposed to be, you kind of like putting your stake in the ground that this is gonna be the third place.
Yep. Yep. We will talk about that in a minute. All right, very good. So now we're going to talk about God secures, well, so if we think about kind of theologically what's going on there, God's favor can be publicly evident even when his promises are not yet realized. God's favor, right, favor on Abraham, was publicly evident, people recognized it, even while his promises, God's promises, are not yet fully realized. Part of it is Abraham couldn't fully possess why couldn't Abraham fully possess the promised land anyway?
He didn't have enough.
Not the people. It actually is interesting, when Joshua goes in, they don't technically possess all the promised land, and part of that's because there weren't enough people then to possess all the promised land.
Still don't, of course.
Well, no, they never
Supposed
did.
to go all the way to the Euphrates River.
Well, it's never been fulfilled. We'll see that during the millennial kingdom, most likely. I say most likely because people argue about that, but if there is indeed a continual land promise, it will be fulfilled in the millennial kingdom, most likely. Okay, verse 7, as we get to there, God secures his promises through ordinary and public means. God secures his promises through ordinary and public means. Abraham rose, bowed down to the Hittites, the people of the land, said to them, if you are willing for me to buy my dead, listen to me, and ask Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf to give me the cave at Machpelah that belongs to him. It is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me in your presence for the full price as burial property. So Abraham apparently has already scouted out the place he wants. So when he starts this, he knows the land he wants. And so he says, I just think the story is interesting. So he asked, ask on my behalf, ask this guy on behalf. Since you're saying you're not going to withhold the property for me, but he does say he's going to pay for it. Give it to me in your presence for the full price. So he's not saying just give it to you. He's willing to pay the full price as burial property. I just find verse 10 humorous. So y'all go talk to this Ephron dude about me owning his property. Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. So clearly Abraham knows who owns it, but doesn't know the person that owns it because he's sitting in that group and he doesn't know it, or doesn't realize it. So Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. So on the hearing of all the Hittites who came to the gate of the city, anytime you see gate of the city, what does it tell us? It's like the public hall. It's where business was done.
Our courts and everything at the gate of the city.
Yep, so when you see gate of the city, that's where business was done in public, right? Because that's, so you could find Lot where? The gate of the city at Sodom, so you knew how engaged he was in the community. So anyway, he was sitting there, heard of all the Hittites, the gate of the city. Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham, no, my Lord, listen to me. I give you the field. I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the sight of my people. Bury your dead. So it's very generous, right? It's clearly a good piece of property, and he wants to just give it to Abraham, which kind of goes to what they had said in the previous verses. None of us are going to withhold our best property from you. And so they're willing to give it to him, again, because they respect God, respect Abraham, maybe fearful of God because they know Abraham and have heard of his battles that he's won. So all that put together, they're willing to give it to him. Abraham bowed down to the people of the land, again, showing respect of the people around, and not showing an entitlement mentality that he deserves. You know, it would be easy for Abraham to say, hey, God's already said this is all mine anyway, so y'all might as well give it to me. But that's clearly not his attitude. Abraham bowed down to the people of the land, said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, listen to me, if you please. Let me pay the price of the field, accept it from me, and let me bury my dead there. So again, he's going to insist on paying the price for the field. And remember, we've had this before. Abraham didn't want to, Abraham doesn't want to have anything given to him. He wants to pay for it because he wants to show that it comes from God, and what I have doesn't come from you. Ephraim answered and said to him, my Lord, listen to me. Land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. So he's almost saying, it's only 400 shekels of silver. What difference does it really make? Go ahead and bury it there. But Abraham agreed with Ephron. It was worth 400 shekels. And he weighed it out for Ephron the silver, and that he agreed to in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 standard shekels of silver. So we paid the price. They agreed on what the price was, and so Abraham paid it. Why does the text devote so much space to negotiation details? Right? I mean, that's a pretty extended conversation. Why does the text devote so much space to it?
It seems like a very stylized Eastern negotiation, a formal negotiation between people, saying, please listen to me.
Okay.
Please talk to Ephron. Get him to sell me this land. And then Ephron says, no, I'll give it to you. And then he says, what is 400 shekels worth of land between you and me? As if saying, well, I don't really want to give it to you. Here's the price of it.
Mine says, and then when I give you the field, basically it's that Ephron was constrained by Hittite feudal polity. And it talks about whoever owns the land had to pay the taxes and duties on it.
Huh.
So there's some hesitancy there, or either, this kind of says that it suggests not that he felt generous, but that he was constrained by the policy. And then at the end, Ephraim was anxious to do this, thus to give the land away. Because of the taxes and the duties on it.
He was getting a tax cut.
Yeah, he was getting a tax break, but there's a donation.
You know, too, do you think to some degree the fact that there was an audience around? There were a lot of people to witness this. And, the need for God to have the glory in this.
Yeah, and I think,
To me, that would be important. It wasn't a private deal behind closed doors.
right.
Yeah,
he's doing it in front of everybody, so there's no question that he paid for it. God's the one that's giving him the provision to be able to pay for it. I would think 400 shekels, I didn't read anything on how much that would be worth, but I can't imagine that that's not a little bit of money.
According to mine, it says 400 shekels of silver was an outrageous price for the piece of property Abraham bought. They weren't thrilled, the Hittites were not thrilled to sell their property to foreigners. So he didn't have anything to bargain with. And he paid.
That's probably where this Hittite feudal polity came into play.
Which is interesting, based on the earlier verses, that they're so willing to
Yeah.
do this.
But it speaks to their
Unless there
character.
was that fear, that the respected fear for God and God's people.
Well, the other part of that is, don't sometimes you say, well, I'll do anything you want me to do, and then sometimes somebody asks you, and you're like, no, that's not really what I meant. So that's, that comes into it.
John, why do you suppose Abraham insisted on paying, something not accepted as a gift?
Okay, so we'll go to our next question. Because it answers, because it's hand in hand with what you just asked. How does this transaction publicly affirm Abraham's claim to the land? And so that's part of what it is this is the first land that Abraham owns in the promised land. So even though it's something small, this is the foothold. So, what's that?
Stake in the ground.
This is the stake in the ground. This is the first land that he actually owns in the promised land. And so something simple, so we're talking about like simple transaction, ordinary means, God is beginning the fulfillment of his promise through the simple means of a burial plot, that this is his land. So, so that's part of why it's public, but that's also why it's so important for the people to know that Abraham paid for it, because goes back to what Daniel was saying, it's the starting of it's the partial fulfillment of God giving him the promised land. This is the foot in the door, so to speak, that he has for starting to have the land there.
Well, I mentioned it was still binding years later in the time of Jacob, they give it the scripture a little bit.
Well, you know, when you get to, in the Exodus, this is the property that they're gonna bring back the bones of Joseph to.
Yeah.
You remember when Joseph dies, he goes, when you go back, because he knew, even though they were in the land of Egypt, when we get to the end of Genesis, when we get to chapter 50, it's gonna say, take my bones back to here. And we don't actually see that fulfilled until, Joshua. The bones actually, you actually don't see the bones brought back from Joseph until the book of Joshua.
But was it that the Hittites didn't want him to own the land? They just wanted to allow him to bury it there.
Let's say that again.
They didn't want him to own the land. They were gonna give it to him, but they were gonna give him the burial plot, not the
Yes.
ownership.
Correct, because that way it's still ours and I can do with the property what I want to, because I'm the owner regardless of what I just said. But that's why he also wanted to pay for it and publicly,
Yes.
so that it is my land.
Right.
Yep.
See, and the romantic in me makes me just think he wants to own the land, but he has to leave there. I guess I'm wrong on that one, huh?
Well, it must, and that, I mean, that's probably part of it. But you've got a lot of other stuff. Right, but I think that's probably part, because he does want to own it because he wants it to be his place, where his wife is, where he's going to get buried. And we're going to see multiple family members buried there. So yeah, you want to own it because that way you can put future generations there. But it also turns out to be the first property that Abraham owns in the promised land.
But he didn't know it at the time.
Well, yeah, I think he probably knew it was the first land he owned.
Yeah, I mean, as far as that it was the first land he would own in the promised land. He knew that that was the promised land at that point.
Yeah, because God's got him to survey it.
Okay.
See, he wandered, he's wandered around it. So he's got a fairly good, he should have a fairly good idea of what it is now. So what does this teach us about the way God works in history?
This isn't directly with your question, but one thing that stands
Why
out.
start now? I'm just kidding.
With the fact that it mentions silver, I did not know until I took ancient Near Eastern history at Southeastern that there is no reference to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob outside of the Bible in any of the ancient Near Eastern cultures. Yet silver was more valuable than gold amongst all of them. So, and then a lot of the customs that we read in Genesis parallel, like, is it Mari, M-A-R-I tablets?
Yeah, I think so.
And N-U-Z-I, I don't know how you correctly pronounce it.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, but just a lot of parallels in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, and the silver being more valuable than gold was one that just stood out to me.
It is interesting when you think about the Abraham not being mentioned. It's only about 140, however many people it was, and then they leave. Well, really, until, they're not a large people until 2 generations later. It's just one family, with one son, one legal son, one main son. So it's a small family, so it would make sense, plus you're not going to talk about the history of somebody else. So it makes sense that they're not in the history of the other nations, until they're mentioned as the Hebrews when they come back after the Exodus.
And they would document the land transfer in the systems.
Actually, that was done publicly too, which was.
Well, but I'm just thinking, how many people are still around?
So basically, family burial cemetery. And so
They shook hands.
That's the lives of Abraham,
Yeah.
Sarah, Isaac, Rebecca. A lot of people there.
Joseph, yeah.
lot of bones.
That's right. Wonder where the cave is.
Right. Well, in Hebron somewhere.
I would imagine they know where the tomb is, because I guess it'd be a site that people of Israel would probably want to see.
Maybe if they know where it is, they would. But I don't know if they know where it's at. Hebron, by the way, what's significant about Hebron?
David was king there.
Yep, that's for the first 20 years or 10 years of David, I forget the number, but the first significant portion of David's kingdom, he actually was in Hebron, because he was only, if you remember, other commander got one of Saul's sons to be king so he could have all the power, and David actually was not the king of all 12 tribes until much later. Anyway, we're not on that, but anyway, so it comes later. Let's see. So as we think about 7 through 16, God advances his redemptive purposes not only through miracles, but through normal legal, economic, and social processes. I thought that was a good point. God advances his redemptive purposes not only through miracles, and certainly God uses miracles, but then sometimes it's just through normal legal, economic, and social processes. And again, we see that throughout the Bible. Okay, God marks the fulfillment with a lasting sign. God marks the fulfillment with a lasting sign, verse 17. So Ephron's field at Machpelah near Mamre, the field with its cave and all the trees, anywhere within the boundaries of the field, became Abraham's possession in the sight of all the Hittites who came to the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave of the field of Machpelah near Mamre, that is Hebron, and in the land of Canaan. The field with its cave passed from the Hittites to Abraham as burial property. Why might a burial site be an appropriate first fulfillment of the land of promise? Why might a burial site be an appropriate first fulfillment of the land of promise?
Well, I don't know, does it have anything to do with, we just celebrated Resurrection Sunday and Jesus' burial site that was empty? I don't know.
Do you do anything with a graveyard?
No, if you try to move it, well, you got issues. That's permanent.
There is permanency in the grave site that's not in something else.
And in fact, like Leonard pointed out, is that there's a lot of ancestors that will continue to be buried in that site. You know, it's not just not moving that one, but that's a continual use of that same burial site, you know, for the family.
Yeah.
So there's permanence for the one, but there's permanence
For the ancestors as well.
ongoing, yes.
Yep.
You got history.
You got history there, and it's a memorial that this is where it started.
But a lot of memorials places have monuments and everything, I don't know if it's anything like that. Yeah.
All right, how does this land acquisition function as a theological statement rather than merely a practical one? How does this land acquisition function as a theological statement rather than merely a practical one?
It's a small step in fulfillment of promise.
Kind of already talked about it. It is the
Yeah.
first step, it's the first piece of land that he actually owns. What does this moment teach us about how God connects present reality with future hope? What does this moment teach us about God connecting present reality with future hope? Reality is he's got to deal with burying his wife, and the mourning that goes with that. But by the same token, it's the hope of knowing that this is the promised land, and this is where God's going to allow his ancestors and all the promises that God has made him. Actually, I texted Alyssa Evans Easter morning. Just got to thinking about it after our services here. I'm just thinking as a pastor's wife, they got married right out of high school, or, I mean, like, right out of high school. Because I started doing the math of how long they've been married, and the numbers didn't make a lot of sense, to be honest. They had to get married at like 17, 18. So, anyway, it's been a long time, and Kermit's been a pastor since he was like right out of high school, because he didn't even have a degree when he first started pastoring. So, it was her first Easter without Kermit in 40-some years, 30-some, 40 years. And anyway, so I was just like, I know this has got to be a tough day for you. You know, you've got the first one without Kermit, and yet it's still the hope that lies in the resurrection of Jesus. That's the hope that we have. And she texted something back about that was the chance, you know, yeah, that it was, you know, that in the sadness there's still the hope. And that's really what we, you know, again, there's even in dealing with the reality, even in dealing with the death of a loved one, it's the hope that we have that Christ is going to return and that we'll see our loved ones again in heaven. So even in death tends to be the most real thing that we deal with. Everything else can come and go, but you know, that's there, and it's permanent. So,
You know, we learned about that real early too, because with Kate talking about it the other day,
Yeah.
people die. I mean, she's 4 years old,
yeah.
but she knows she's gonna see mom in heaven
Yeah.
already.
And that's what we told her, but she said, but I still want to go back to her house and see. And then she said, I want to go to heaven, but I want to come back home. So it's a 4-year-old perspective on the situation.
Well, there's a black comedian Barbara and I were watching one day. And he was talking about his first experience at church. He's like 12 or 13 years old, and he is the first time he's ever been in a church before, and it's for a funeral. And so they talk about the person died, that they're going to be in God's presence, they're going to see the King and all this kind of stuff. You know, they start singing very soon, we're going to see the King. It was like, I don't want to see the King. I don't want to see the King. I don't want to die that soon. Yeah, it was humorous. It was hilarious. Anyway, all right, so as we think about this passage, just some things that we can do just to consider practically for us today. Pay attention to small fulfillments of God's promises in Scripture, recognizing them as stepping stones towards greater completion. Recognize small fulfillments of promises in Scripture, recognizing them as steps and stones towards greater completion. I think one of the things that we do worst, I do worst, and I don't think I'm alone, is we don't always take time to recognize small blessings and acknowledge God for those. So, couple with the family that's over here for the Easter breakfast that has been coming to Dan River for sunrise service for African American family, black family, been coming 20-some years, right? So I see them once a year on Easter Sunday. And so one of the sons, I remember at the grocery store the other day, and I'm walking down the aisle in the food line, and one of the sons just looked at me and was like, hey, how you doing? Stuck his hand out to give me a fist bump, and I'm like, well, that was just pretty cool. One, that he recognized me, because if it wasn't this week, he probably wouldn't. And certainly I wouldn't recognize him. And but then there's just to have that positive reaction as I was just walking down the aisleway at Food Line. It was like, well, you know, that's just pretty cool. And made sure I took time to thank God for. In fact, I called Madeline when I got in the car and said, this is just pretty cool. And I think we don't always do that because there are times that God gives us encouragements that we don't look for or we don't notice. And sometimes fulfillments of promises that He's given us to encourage us, to bless us. And so I think it's important that we take time for just those small things that God does.
So basically saying sit back and watch God at work?
Well, I don't know about sit back and watch, but I would say stay alert and be aware that He is working. Because the idea of sitting back gives can give the inference that we're not doing anything. We certainly don't want to be sitting back too much. But we do need to be alert to when God is fulfilling promises.
I'm glad you said that, because I didn't know who that David was. There was some younger kid, like teenagers and stuff.
Yeah.
And I just thought, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, he's been coming. God, you remember the original story? I mean, I think it was like Dan River was the only sunrise service they could find one year. And so they came here for a sunrise service, and they've come to everyone since then. Is that Bob shaking his head?
Yeah, I knew them from out at ABB. But that's how they showed up here the first time,
And they've come every year for,
for 20 years.
yeah, I know it's been a long time, so. Anyway,
You also had Dean's nephew here that hadn't been in a church in a very, very
Oh,
long
really?
time. He's been baptized, he was baptized over at Ash, but they do not attend church regularly. But he said, we just decided we were gonna get up and come to Dan River this morning.
cool. Read narratives of loss with theological attentiveness, asking what the text reveals about God rather than jumping quickly to personal application. Read narratives of loss with theological, and I would say this for any passage, but we'll talk about loss for this one. With theological attentiveness, asking what the text reveals about God rather than jumping quickly to personal applications. I love the way Chris Holshoff's one of my subject matter experts for a class that I teach, Survey of Old and New Testament. I love the way he says it in one of the things he writes up for one of the assignments and in his book, Everyday Bible Study. Don't look at the Bible looking for a moral of the story. Because so often that's what we do. We look at a passage and we look for the moral of the story. And that is underselling what the Bible is about. There may be a moral of the story that we can learn from. But the important part is the passage was written to teach us about God. And so the question to ask for any passage we read is, what does it read about God? And so the assignments we do for that class are that's what it is like how to study the Bible or surveying the Old and New Testament, is very much about trying to teach our students, think theologically, not application. Think theologically, not application. And that's, so when we read a passage, it's kind of like even just going through the prayer time. We're talking about today in our prayer time that I do on Wednesday. And the guy said, when I read a passage now, I just think about it. What is it that I want to revere God about? How do I want to reverence God? What does that passage teach me about God and His attributes that I want to revere? And then what does it teach me about what God has done? And how do I respond to that? And then what does God want me to do? But the application is always the last step. And so we want to read narratives of loss with theological attentiveness. Also reflect on how God uses ordinary means, legal systems, public recognition, time to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Because sometimes God can use the simple things to accomplish His extraordinary purposes. So God works in the big stuff, He works in the small stuff. That's why the small stuff's important. That's why we don't pray to God only for the important things or the big things or the things that we perceive to be big and important. Because you never know when something small is going to make a difference. You just never know when it's going to make a difference. Practice patient hope, grounded in knowledge that God's promises progress even when fulfillment appears partial or slow. Practice patient hope, grounded in knowledge that God's promises progress even when fulfillment appears slow or partial or slow. I was thinking about 1 Peter when it says God is not slack concerning His promises. Jesus is going to return. It's funny. It's Peter's right. They're already like, well, why didn't Jesus come back yet? And here we are now 2,000 years later. And people are wondering why Jesus ain't come back yet. But even when it seems partial or slow, we need to make sure that we stay grounded in God's promises. A couple things to wrap up, kind of summarize the chapter 23. Dr. Selhammer said, wherever possible, the writer seizes the opportunity to show that the patriarchs come by their possession of the land fairly, in that it was a gift from God, not from those who were dwelling in the land at the time. So, again, this idea, and we've seen it twice now, where Abraham says, no, I'm going to pay you. I'm not going to take it just as a gift. And then Alan Ross, the time of death, when the natural inclination is to mourn as the world mourns. All right, so the time of death, when the natural inclination is to mourn as the world mourns, should be the time of our greatest demonstration of faith. For the recipient of God's promises as a hope beyond the grave. God is the God of the living. So just a couple reminders. Jesus said in Mark chapter 12, God is the God of the living. When talking to the Pharisees, he's talking about Abraham and Isaac. He's not talking about the God of the dead. He's the God of the living. So Abraham and Isaac are living. as Jesus talks in Mark. And then Hebrews observes that all die, in Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith, it goes through all the names that we know, and then it talks about others that we don't know about, and it says he observes that all died, not receiving the promises, yet they died in faith, right? Because they haven't received the promises, because they're from the Old Testament, Jesus hadn't died yet, but they still died in faith. Genesis 23 reveals a God who is steadfast, patient, and quietly faithful, even in death. God's covenant purposes move forward. Chapter invites the reader to see that God's promises are not negated by grief, delayed fulfillment, or everyday human processes. Instead, God weaves them together into his unfolding plan. All right. Any questions?
So now that he's legally purchased land in the promised land, people can't say they don't have a claim to the promised land.
However, that's the only land they purchased.
But they
I
got a
was
foot
gonna
on
ask,
it.
did he,
I don't think they purchase anything else, because when they come back, they're going to fight for it and possess it that way.
Exactly. So they got all of it for 400 shekels.
The whole promised land, more than just.
All right, very good. All right, let's pray. Dear God, we come before you tonight just to praise you as God. Thank you for the blessings. Thank you that you are faithful to your promises, even when sometimes we didn't think so. And Lord, help us to increasingly have a greater view of who you are and a greater understanding of your presence. It's in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.